started in about 5 minutes. I hope you are excited. It's a popping good time.
Page me more bin time. Page me pisid kaide.
Presented by Page Wizard Games, Learning and Entertainment. It's that time, everybody. time for more entertainment and fun with your favorite computer scientist, Dr. Daniel Page. Welcome to Dan Plays, where Dan has fun with friends and we talk about all sorts of fun things, including computer science and everything under the sun. No barriers, just fun. Check out all the fun rewards and supporter access at the links. That's enough for now. Let's get started. Come on, Dan. Let's get started.
Hello everybody! I hope everyone's having a beautiful day. I want to welcome you on to today's live lecture. If it's your first time here, my name is Dr. Daniel Page, but you can just call me Dan or Daniel. I hope you're having a beautiful day. I want to welcome you on down. Let me know in the chat how you're doing today. Hope you're having an amazing day so far. Good morning, good morning. So before we get started today, just a couple quick announcements. So the first one is that I'm doing good. I'm excited for today's topic. Today's topic is going to be Pushdown Automata, which we're going to be talking about this entire lecture. So we'll talk about what they are and so on. I'll get into more detail about that in a moment. But a couple quick announcements. So the first one is, if you haven't yet, please complete the survey. I'm going to put a link actually just right now in the chat over here. Let me get the chat up. That way everybody can enjoy the fun of text-to-speech. Let me just get the chat up. I'm just going to get the URL. I'll put it in the chat.
https://forms.gle/8gzr599fs2pmt8qk6.
That. If you haven't completed the survey, please consider doing so. In fact, today's topic is related to one of those suggested in the survey. So it does have an impact on things, and the best way you can suggest your topics is considering by supporting at patreon.com/pagewizard. We also have support via Subscribestar as well, but it's the easiest way for you to reach out, give suggestions, and also that is also where the notes from today's lecture will be available afterwards. So later today I'll make sure to put out an announcement when those become available for everyone. So the other announcement is, of course, that there's going to be some construction happening here for the next week or two. So I'll be back in about 2 to 3 weeks with our next live lecture. And after that point, seeing as it's spring and summer, and I know some people like to go do some fun stuff, I definitely am committed to my role here. So I will be still conducting lectures, but it will most certainly still be, it'll be at a less regular pace. So instead of it being every week, perhaps it might be twice a month, for example, like maybe every other week. We'll see. If I can get more lectures in, that's wonderful. But most certainly the content will still be coming here on the channel. It just won't be as regular as in almost every day of the week. So this is so I can focus in on other educational projects, such as the books that I'm currently working on, that you'll get to enjoy to help enhance or boost your computer science learning. And some other things, such as game projects and more. Anyways, so hopefully that sounds pretty exciting to you. I know it excites me. I, of course, love lecturing, so it always disappoints me when I say I don't get to lecture as much as I would like to. But anyways, we're going to be talking today about Pushdown Automata. Now, before we get into things here and describe what that is, and give a formal definition and how it works, see some examples, and ultimately we'll see, because really that's the goal of today's lecture, is to find out what a pushdown automaton is, and how you formally describe it, how you could design a pushdown automaton. In addition, also talk about how we could describe the operations of one of these machines. So that's going to be the goal of today's lecture, is to talk about what it is, how it works, and a couple properties it has. So I must stress that it might sound like that's very brief stuff, but I must stress that even though it's very intuitive, to describe it formally might take us a little bit of mathematical, there's that M word, the mayonnaise. It will require some machinery to get there. So keep in mind, we're talking about a model computation. So everything we're going to describe here, it's for making a good sandwich with mayonnaise or mustard. So hope you're excited for that. I know I am. But also, at the heart of this construction will be something that'll distinguish it from the other automata we've seen so far. It will be namely something called the stack, which I'll introduce in a moment. So if you've never heard of what a stack is, that's okay. I'll be talking about what that is as well. But for those with a data structures background, may know what a stack is. So other than that, that's going to be the goal for today's lecture. As per usual, if the chat is visible on the screen, the text-to-speech or the chat will be visible on the screen. Just because it's not visible on the screen doesn't mean I can't hear it or see it. I have a monitor right there. So if you have questions during the lecture, please just put it in the chat. Or if you have anything to introduce or suggest, please just put it in the chat. Join the fun. If you want to have some fun, telling fun jokes in the chat, get me cracking here. That is also good. And please join the fun. Join the fun. But beyond that, just please, if you have questions, I'll try to answer them on the fly. If I can't answer it on the fly, I'll move to, when I go to the intermission, which will happen whenever I have the chat visible on the screen like this, I'll address it there if it takes a little bit more time to digest or go through it carefully, okay? So, is everybody excited for today? I know I am. I even included a special button, which I'm not going to press the button until we actually get to the point where it's needed. I brought a button. I brought a button. Okay, so let's get started here. So today we're going to be talking about pushdown automata. Now, before I could get into a definition, I think it's a good idea I give you a feel for what a pushdown automaton is. I think what will help do this is connect it to things that we've already discussed up to this point. So what we're going to do is we're going to let us consider a more descriptive, meaning that it's able to describe more languages. That's a little bit of a spoiler. More descriptive finite automaton. With two main ideas. So I'm just going to switch markers here. So the two main ideas are going to be, one, well, we know it's going to be involving a finite automaton. So this is going to be something that's going to use this aspect of a finite automaton, but we're going to add a couple more features to it. So we're gonna beef it up. That's not a technical phrase, I just think it's fun. So I'm gonna beef up the finite automaton by giving it the ability to remember things. So the first part of this will be that I'm going to use one of the more versatile finite automatons that we had seen previously. So can anybody recall, so we've seen a few different kinds, right? We've seen a deterministic finite automaton, we've seen a non-deterministic finite automaton, and we also seen a non-deterministic finite automaton with epsilon transitions or epsilon moves. So what I'm going to do is, because the epsilon moves and the non-determinism give me a lot more versatility for how I can design these machines, I'm going to use that as our starting point. I must stress that that starting point does matter in this case, but I'm going to actually start off with, so we're going to start off, imagine I give you an epsilon NFA, and I'm going to introduce to it a stack. So we're going to give it a stack. So this stack can store strings of what we'll refer to as stack symbols. Stack symbols. So I'll give you a little picture just to give you an idea of what we're looking at here. So you can imagine you have what we had as our finite automaton, which you could think of as finite state control. So it's just a finite state control. It takes in input and it accepts or rejects, right? So that's what you would expect with a finite automaton, right? So it's going to transition from state to state. It's going to do stuff with the input. Namely, it's going to read the input. We'll describe it in a somewhat different way when we talk about a pushdown automaton. But the aspect of this that will differ now is I'm going to allow the automaton to have some form of a way to remember things. And this is what the stack is going to be used for. The stack interacts with the finite state control. So this is going to be an integral part of how this PDA, pushdown automaton, is going to operate. So there's going to be two aspects that are going to make this a little different. The first one is that we're going to have the stack, but the stack is also going to interact with the states of the machine. So this stack idea, so the reason why I'm bringing in the stack is, so this stack can allow the automaton to, and I'm going to use the word remember because I'm just adding some agency to a machine that for which does not have agency. But we can allow the automaton to remember as much as we like. So there is no finite limit on the storage. So we can, if we need more memory, as in to store this stack, we have it. Just please keep that in mind. So you might ask, Dan, what exactly is a stack? So before we get into talking about this, I need to make sure we're all up to speed what a stack is. So a stack, you may have been introduced to this idea of a stack in, say, a data structures course. If not, let me talk a little bit about it. So you can imagine we're going to have these stack symbols. So what we're going to have is we're going to start off with a start symbol on the stack. So we're going to start off with something on the stack. That's just a design feature for how we're going to define our PDAs. It doesn't have to be that way. So imagine I have this plate. So we can, of course, stack plates up, right? We can have a stack of plates. So, of course, a stack, you can place plates on the top of the stack, right? You place plates on top of the stack, but you can also remove plates from where? Where do you remove plates from? Well, typically, if you imagine this as a big, heavy stack of plates, usually you remove them from the top of the stack, correct? So what I want you to do is imagine this is how we're representing this memory of sorts. And remember, for those that are a little bit more in tune with the idea of a stack and how it interacts with memory, with programs, a stack gives us versatility for things like function calls and other things like that. So with that being said, you can imagine that I have it where I can push the plate onto the top of the stack. I can take a peek at the top of the stack to see what it looks like. But in addition to this, I can also pop or remove from the top of the stack. That's going to be how the rules play with the stack, is that it has to be that we're taking elements, we're placing them on the top or removing from the top of the stack. The stack may become empty, however, if I remove the bottommost plate eventually. So remember that we can push plates onto the top of the stack. So for example, if I have just this plate, I can pop this and now the stack becomes empty. So the stack could be empty or not empty. We can push stack symbols onto the stack via push operations. So I could push this plate, I could push this new plate, I could push this plate, but I can also pop. But I pop from the top of the stack. That's what a pop operation is. So to make this a little easier for us to remember, think of a stack of plates. We can push, but most certainly we can also Yeah, it's pop-in time. You can also pop from the stack. So to help us remember that if we need to pop from the stack, I brought this lovely button here. So if ever we need to do popping, it's poppin' time. Yeah, it's poppin' time. It's poppin' time. So that's how a stack operates when it comes to how it will for this push-down automaton. But it also is just, this is something that appears very often in places such as in data structures. It's not a coincidence that it'll pop up here as well. For those that are a little in tune with computers, like I said, you might have the idea that I mentioned just a moment ago. So this is actually giving us a lot of computational power by introducing a stack. So this is allowing us to have some form of memory of what's happening at a given state. So this actually gives us some versatility now for designing the automata beyond just having a finite number of states. Now we also can have it where we can actually take a look at what the top of the stack looks like. So all of our actions now are going to be related to both the state and also what the top of the stack might look like. So those are going to be conditional in relation to how we look at the input. So let's talk a little bit about this now. So for those that are not as familiar with stacks, the way that the stack symbols operate when it comes to the stack, so I'll just give you a recap of what I just summarized here. So this finite state control over there, it reads the input, one after another, just like you know about, so this is what the finite control does. It reads the input one after the other, but here's the idea, is it's going to be that you can have it where it's going to, as I'm going to mention in a moment, it's going to try to consume a symbol. So it actually can make moves on epsilon, which means it's not actually consuming a symbol, akin to what we talked about with the epsilon NFA, where it could freely move. Same thing can happen here. So just keep that in mind. I'll mention this in a moment. But I must stress that on transitions, so on transitions, so we can peak at the top of the stack, we can push or pops stack symbols. And of course, these transitions are going to depend on the current state. The current state, an input symbol, so the one you're currently looking at, possibly. Input symbol. And the top of the stack. So I must stress that it will be able to freely move on epsilon. But just keep in mind that the two big things that are going to matter a lot when it comes to definition for the PDA is its state and what's going on with the stack. As long as you remember those two details and how they can operate independent of each other, then you're in a very good place. Is that clear, everybody? So when a transition happens, that he was looking a little sad. So what it does is it processes or consumes, I like to call it consuming, consumes from the input the symbol used for the transition. And I must stress that no input symbol is consumed. Is consumed or used if epsilon, the empty string, is used for the input. So when it does this, it might move on epsilon, it might consume a symbol. So just think of this consuming a symbol just like it's reading the next symbol. Just like we had when we talked about our finite automaton in the past. So upon doing this, it moves to possibly a new state. So it can transition to another state. Then something else happens. And this is something that makes it different than things we've seen up to this point. So something else is going to happen here. So maybe I'll number these. 1, 2, 3. So what the third thing it will do when a transition happens is it's going to what's going to happen is it's going to be replacing, or it replaces the symbol at the top of the stack with some other string. With some other string. So now there's a few cases that can happen here. First, if the top symbol of the stack is replaced with epsilon. When it's replaced with epsilon, you might ask, Dan, what does it do if it's replaced with epsilon? Well, think of it like you're going to, because remember, when it says it replaces the symbol at the top of the stack, if I'm replacing the symbol at the top of the stack with epsilon, I have effectively wiped it out. So that corresponds to... It's poppin' time. It pops the stack. So pop the stack. Another possibility is that the top of the stack, may not change. If the string is the same as the symbol on top of the stack. Finally, we can have a push operation occur. Or even the string may consist of more than one symbol. So pushes may occur, which may correspond to pushing multiple symbols onto the stack. So in plain language, we have three things that can happen when it's taking a look at the top of the stack. It might push, it may stay the same, or it's poppin' time. Yeah, exactly. So I wanna give us some intuition behind this. I thought it'd be a good idea. We get an idea for how this works, and then we'll define what a PDA is, a push-down automaton. So is that clear, everybody? So what's going to happen is just think of it just like you had with an epsilon NFA, except now we have this stack, and now whenever we do transitions, now it depends both on the state and what the stack looks like. So I want to give you a motivation for what you can do with this stack. And now I'll go into more detail about what this will look like once we've seen the definition of a PDA. So I'll call this a design example. So just to give you some high-level view of what you can do with a PDA. So let's consider. So consider language. So we're going to consider this language. So 0 to the n, 1 to the n, such that n is greater or equal to 0. So how can we use the above idea? So how can we use the push-down automaton? So how can we do that based on what I've just described over here? So, just as a reminder, is this language regular or not regular? Could somebody tell me? Is that language regular or not regular? I'll give you a hint. We actually proved something about this language in the past. I also will mention that we've also seen how we can design context-free grammars for this language. No, it's not regular. So most certainly a DFA or even an epsilon FA cold turkey won't be able to craft some way to describe this language. So that being said, think about it like this. So remember, we have the stack. So remember, we have a stack. And we also have states, right? We have states that we can be in. So our machine can be in states. And we also have the stack. Now, just for the sake of brevity, imagine we have a string that would be a part of this language. Say 0, 0, 1, 1. So notice it has equal numbers of zeros and ones, where the zeros come before the ones. So this is indeed in this language here. So what would that look like? So I want to think about this in terms of phases. So one thing that's really helpful once we have the stack is we can think about the states as almost having purposes. So when we design the push-down automaton, you can think about it like where we think about the states actually being states, as in it is not just simply a state of, oh, I just need to move to this one thing. You can also think about it like it almost has a explicit design purpose. So this is one thing we get once we get the ability to store and remember things about how we process the input. So here's a suggestion. Break it into 3 phases. So how we're going to process the input is going to be based on 3 phases. So do you notice that we have the ability to now push and pop off this stack, right? So what's one thing that you can notice right away about the form of any string that belongs to this language? Remember, it has equal numbers of zeros as it has ones. So I was going to propose that we make the first phase where it's going to read the zeros. So you can imagine that this machine, it will proceed by reading zeros over and over and over again. So every time it does this, it's going to push a symbol onto the stack. So I must stress that typically when we design our PDAs, we're going to have it where we're going to start off, just like I said over here, we're going to start off with an initial plate on our stack, the start symbol. So we're going to have a starting stack symbol that's going to be on the stack. This is helpful for other reasons that I'm going to talk about a bit more when we get towards the end of our discussion about PDAs. But for our purposes, just imagine there's this initial start symbol there. But every single time I read a zero, because most certainly you can conceive of an automaton where you would just have it where every time it reads a zero, it comes back to the same state, right? You can imagine something like this, right? We've done things like this before. But every time it does read a zero, for each one, we push a stack symbol. And we'll give it a name. We'll say X. Suppose it's X. So for example here, what I'm suggesting is that the first phase, it'll proceed by reading each of these. So it consumes each zero. It'll consume each one of these, gobbling them up. Like it's really, really hungry. This is one hungry machine. For each one of these that gets consumed, it pushes a stack symbol on top of the stack. Namely, we have X over here. So it reads these zeros. It reads the zeros. Does anybody have any ideas what we could do with phase 2 then? So now all we have left, what's left to consume? So one thing that is often helpful when you think about designing these push-down automata is think about what the form of the string has to look like and try to take advantage of the structure that string has when you're coming up with this PDA. So what can I say about the stack if the string belongs to the language? What should the stack look like when I'm done? What should it look like when I'm done? Should there be any X's left on the stack when I'm done processing this input? Well, naturally, yeah, no, there shouldn't be any X's left. No X's. So naturally, if you look at how the stack works, it's actually what we're doing is we're keeping a count of how many zeros we've read. Does everybody see that? So the number of X's that appear on the stack is the number of zeros. So for every single zero, I need to do what?
It's poppin' time.
Pop it. You got to pop those X's. That's what phase 2 is going to do. So we're going to move to read ones. And then what we're going to do,
It's poppin' time.
we're going to pop the stack of a X for each one read. So if I were to consume next 1, what happens?
It's poppin' time.
Right? That gets popped. And when I read this symbol, next, consuming it,
It's poppin' time.
that goes away, and we're left with just our start stack symbol, right? Our starting symbol there. So that naturally gives us a third phase, the one where we check. If no X's are on the stack, we're going to accept. So of course this is under the assumption, assuming no input is read, not recognized by the automaton, it's going to accept, right? If it does not have this form, you would reject, right? So this is under the assumption. This is an assumption I'm making. Otherwise, you would reject, right? So just as an example, suppose we had this string where we have 3 zeros, then a 1. Or actually, let's do something really funky. Actually, now let's go with this. Keep it nice and simple. So if I had this string, it would push, push, push for the first 3 zeros, and then it will pop that 1, right? And notice that I have an X on the top of the stack. Notice that that's actually a condition for which I know that if I use this setup, that there is an equal number of zeros and ones. Do you notice that the reason why we don't have to worry about strings that look like this, for example, where I have a 1, then a bunch of zeros, you notice that I read zeros first, right? So notice it doesn't say read ones. So if I run into a 1, you know you're already in trouble because you should start popping, right? You'd start popping. But what would happen in that case? If you didn't run into any, you're not going to be popping X's, you're going to try to do something with this, right? And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this is what the form would look like, right? So that's one thing I want you to keep in mind when you think about designing the PDA. So you can think of these phases just like states. So hopefully this gives you an intuition for how we're going to use the PDA. So how a PDA will work. So we're going to go into more detail about how that processing does occur with something called instantaneous descriptions. But first, I'm going to now define what a PDA is. So hopefully that's clear, everybody. So we have this idea that we can have states, and we can use the stack to help us find out what's going on. Did you notice that when I came up with this idea here for a PDA, notice it's entirely dependent on the top of the stack, right? That's important. So I'm peaking at the top of the stack. Because that's how I remember things, right? It's because it's on the top of the stack. I can peak at the top of the stack. So let's define now a pushdown automaton, or PDA. I warn you that this is easily going to be one of the most complicated of the types of automata that we're going to be seeing in this lecture. So it's a little bit more of a mouthful, so please bear with me. So a PDA, P, is a 7-tuple. So we've upgraded now to a 7-tuple. And don't get the wrong idea. Just adding more tuples doesn't make the model more sophisticated in terms of its descriptive power of languages. We'll see examples of other ones where they don't have as many tuples or they have maybe the same number. It's just a formulation. So it's going to be a 7-tuple. It's going to have Q. You might guess what some of these already are. Q, sigma. We're going to have gamma, delta, Q0, Z0, and F. So some of these you're going to tell right away what they are. Others look a little more unknown to us. Where? So Q is a finite set of states, right? We have a set of states. What else do we got? Well, what do you think sigma is? What's sigma? Well, it's going to be our input symbols, right? Is a set of input symbols. Now, let's talk about what gamma is. Gamma is a finite stack alphabet. That's its name. It's called a stack alphabet. So we already know what an alphabet is, but just it's associated with the stack. That's why we call it that. So these can be pushed onto the stack. So these are the ones we're manipulating, just like in our example over there, I had X. So notice that X isn't 0 or 1. It's just, that's what the stack, that's a stack symbol. There's other ones that may exist as well. Q0, you might guess quite quickly, is the start state. Now, I already sort of alluded to this, right? That what Z0 is, right? So Z0 is among the stack alphabet, or stack symbols, I'll sometimes refer to them, is the start symbol. Now, for those that are astute, may know that I've also called something else a start symbol in the past involving grammars. That's not a coincidence, just to be very clear. So the way we're going to define the PDA, you don't have to define a PDA like this, but for the sake of our designs, at the beginning, a PDA has a stack where it has only one instance of this symbol. So in plain language, the PDA begins where the stack has Z0 already on it, just like our first initial plate on the stack. So it starts off with a plate on the stack. This has design benefits. For example, we might talk about the idea of an empty stack. So this would require you to get rid of this start symbol off the stack. By doing what? Yeah, that. So, next we have, I'm going to skip over delta for now. So, F, you might guess quite quickly, is the set of accepting your final states. So it's a set of final states. Now, let's talk about delta, the transition function. As usual, I tend to leave this one last because it takes a little bit of time to carefully define it for you. But everything I've already said up to this point should allude to you how transitions work, right? That's why we did this very basic example, is that you can think of it like we're in phases, and you imagine we could push or pop during those phases. Now, of course, I should naturally tell you that if you don't use the stack at all, then you just have an epsilon NFA, right? So if you just choose not to use it for anything, you don't have to, it's just, we're generalizing, right? So lastly, we have the transition function. So delta is a transition function. Where now, instead of it being a pair, it's going to be a triple. Or 3-tuple for those that are keeping an eye on how I use some of this terminology. Where delta is a triple, so its form is going to be a triple or 3-tuple. So XAX, like this, where it's going to be a state, Q, among the states. A is an input symbol, or epsilon. And remember, epsilon is not an input symbol, just like with the epsilon NFA. And lastly, so far this shouldn't look too terribly scary. This is what we had with an epsilon NFA, right? This third part is what makes it different. Now we have the stack symbol X, which is going to be of the stack alphabet, or stack symbols. Now, I haven't told you what this triple outputs for the transition function. So everything I've told you up to this point should give you an idea what is going to come out of this. So it's a state, an input symbol, or epsilon, and a stack symbol. So output of delta is a finite set. So we're going to imagine it just like we had with the epsilon FA, where it outputs. Remember, it outputted a set of states, right? But I told you now that the PDA depends both on the set of states and what the stack looks like, right? So now it actually is going to be a finite set of pairs. So it's not just going to be a set of states anymore. Now it's going to be a set of pairs. P and lowercase gamma, where P is a state, and lowercase gamma is the string of stack symbols that replace X at the top of the stack. So now do you see what X's role is? Top of the stack. So whatever is going to come out of here at part of these pairs, what it's going to do is going to replace X, just like how we talked about what happens is that on a transition, it replaces the top of the stack. And those cases are now going to come up now, just a little bit more formally. So again, I'll write them like this deliberately. If lowercase gamma is equal to the empty string, what should happen if it's the empty string? So it's going to replace at the top of the stack. What did we say that means? What does it mean?
It's poppin' time.
Yeah, it's poppin' time, right? It pops. That's what we said earlier. The stack is popped. Exactly. If we have it where lowercase gamma is equal to X. So remember, that's just us peaking. So now do you see that X is really just us peaking at the top of the stack, right? So now how we define the transitions now is on the state, an input symbol or epsilon, and the top of the stack. So now this, of course, if it's X like this, that's just the top of the stack, right? So this is exactly what we had the second case, right? Then the stack does not change. Does not change. And of course, if it is suppose that lowercase gamma is yz, then x is replaced by z, then y is pushed onto the stack. So we have a little bit of pliability here when it comes to how we consider this third case. So as a result of this, if you're wondering where the top of the stack is, the top of the stack is the symbol on the furthest left. Which at first, for those that are familiar with stacks, this might look a little backwards for you. So the top of the stack will be the leftmost symbol that gets replaced here. So remember, the way transitions work is they operate on the state and the top of the stack, right? So we have to commit to an entire pair. We can't just like mix and match them, right? Just like what we've seen in our example. We can't just mix and match the states and the stack, right? You can't just like, oh, I like this state and I like that stack. No, you have to commit to one of these pairs, and there's only going to be a finite. It's going to be a finite set of these pairs that are possible. So that's what a PDA is. Hopefully you found the intuition a little helpful to get to this definition. So are there any questions about what a PDA is? Any questions? Any questions at all? Don't be shy. I'm just taking a look at what we got coming next. Yeah, next we're going to be talking about some conventions around drawing transition diagrams and also seeing a basic example of a PDA. So what I'm ideally going to do is I'm going to actually show you the example we had before, but give it in this formal context. So why don't we see the example then? It doesn't seem like we have any questions, so let's proceed with the poppin'. I'll make sure I press the button.
It's poppin' time.
If there's any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. So what I'm going to do with our next example here is I'm going to actually lay out a formal description of the example that we just saw. And then we'll do another example of designing a PDA. And then we'll see how exactly this processing exactly works. So we're going to talk about this concept, as I said previously, of what are called instantaneous descriptions. So this concept of instantaneous descriptions becomes rather useful once you start dealing with computational models for which more, like it isn't just simply, I'm in a state. Now it actually has a description of what currently is going on at any one execution point of the machine. And I must stress, because of the non-determinism in our machine, it may be in several of them at the exact same time. Just please keep that in mind. So I thought it would be a good idea, now that we've seen the definition of a PDA, let's revisit the example we had, and I'm going to define it more formally now. So suppose let's consider PDA P. Where we're going to have Q, remember the set of states, the input symbols, our tape alphabet or tape symbols. No, not tape. I'm getting ahead of myself. So we have the set of states, the input symbols, our stack alphabet or stack symbols. transition function, the start state, the start symbol of the stack, and of course our set of final states. We're going to define it like this, where Q is going to be, there's going to be exactly 3 states, Q0, Q1, Q2. If you've seen our design intuition here, this should match up with having 3 phases, right? So just as a reminder, we're going to be considering this language. 0 to the n, 1 to the n, such that n is greater or equal to 0. So our input symbols are going to be 0, 1. So we got 0 or 1. Our tape alphabet is going to be Z0 or X. We're going to have Q0 is the start state. I kind of just made it easy enough for us to see right there, right? And Z0 is the start symbol. But I'm going to define the set of final states that only contain Q2. This is going to correspond to our third phase in our previous example, when we had the kind of our game plan for how we would design the PDA. So now that I've defined those, I need to actually give you a definition of delta, the transition function. So I'm going to do it formally, and then I'm going to show you how we can represent this using a transition diagram. So this is going to be what we call a generalized transition diagram, because we also have to encapsulate the behavior of the stack, among other things. So next we're going to talk about what delta is. So I'm going to break it down in terms of the phases that we had. Hopefully that's going to be clear to everybody. I'm going to break it down into the phases. So at the start, if a 0 is read, we push 1x onto the stack. So what is this going to look like when we actually use the triples? So we have delta. We're at the start state, right? We're going to have it where if I see a 0, I'm going to want to gobble up it like a hungry hippo. I want to gobble that sucker up. And if there is at the top of the stack the start symbol, well, what did we do, right? What did we do? We pushed an X, right, onto the stack. So if we look at the set of pairs that we will have, it says that it's going to stay in Q0. And what the stack's going to look like is we're going to push X onto the stack, like this. So just note that this is telling me how I'm modifying the top of the stack. So there's another possibility that can happen, right, when I'm reading the zeros. What else can happen? So remember, let me just doodle a little stack here. So remember, it starts off with Z0 right here. So this accounts for the case that if I consume a 0, like a hungry hippo, when I consume the 0, when the top of the stack is Z0, it pushes an X. What if I have another 0? What would the top of the stack look like then? What's the top of the stack going to be in that case? Is it Z0? It's not going to be Z0 anymore, right? So we need to account for the case when the top of the stack, when we take a peek at it, we take a peek at the top of the stack, it's going to be an X. So when we have that happen, what should happen? Well, we gobble up the 0, push an X, right? But we stay in Q0. So the top of the stack is an X, I'm going to push an So notice that this will actually account for the first phase. Does everybody see that? So do you notice that there's no other described transitions here on 1, right? So you might ask, Dan, what happens in those cases? It's just like when we talked about with NFAs or epsilon NFAs. Those are when those threads will just die, quote unquote. They get killed. So then you might ask, how do you go from phase 1 to phase 2? Remember, phase 1 is where we read the zeros and we push x's. I was about to say pop, we push the x's. But we need to move to the next phase. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to need to consider if that happens. So that's what's going to be this next part. Then the PDA may take an epsilon move to Q1. And when it's in Q1, that's when we can start reading the ones, right? Think of them as the different phases. So now I need to describe these epsilon moves. So now remember, on an epsilon move, you don't consume a symbol, right? So we have delta, Q0. So we're still in Q0, right? But remember, now the way we process, now it depends on both the state and what the top of the stack looks like. So we need to account for 2 cases, right? Because the stack might look differently for 2 possibilities, right? Because technically speaking, the empty string is a part of this language, right? It could be 0 zeros and 0 ones, right? Which that's the empty string. So I need to make sure I account for that as well, because that means that the start symbol has to be present on the top of the stack in that case. Do you know? I'll let you think about what would happen if I require that there's at least 1 0 and at least 1 1. So in this case, it should go straight to Q1 without gobbling up a symbol. And the top of the stack remains Q0. Not Q0, Z0. Like I said, even I understand that they are closely linked at this stage now. So now I have Q0, epsilon, and now it might be an X at the top of the stack. So in this case, we're not touching the top of the stack. We want to keep it the same, right? So notice that now we can be in state Q1. Naturally, when you're in Q1, we want to make sure that now we got to do what? What do we have to do, guys? What do we have to do, everybody? Are we pushing at this stage or what are we doing?
It's poppin' time.
Exactly. So next, X's may have been pushed so we're going to pop the stack on each one. And I mean a 1, like the number. The number that is a symbol in our case. Not 1 like there's only 1 of them, okay? So what is this going to look like then? So we're going to be in state Q1, right? If it reads, it's going to gobble up a 1. If it does, it has to be that the top of the stack has an X on it, right? And if that's the case, remember we'd said if you want to pop the stack, you'd change the top of the stack to be epsilon, the empty string. So this will do.
It's poppin' time.
It does the poppin'. Does the poppin'. So finally, now we have to actually have the check to see that we've indeed correctly have equal numbers of zeros and ones, and based on the way we structured these transitions, it will be the case that the zeros come before the ones. That's one subtle detail here. Is finally we need to make sure we can check. We do the final check. I put some more details in the notes, but the final check, is that we need to have an epsilon move that takes us from Q1 to Q2. So I'm going to use this opportunity to be the check, the last phase. So if I can get into the last phase, then we're done, right? Because I said we'd accept if we're in that phase, right? However, if our thread gets killed before we can get over there, then we certainly can't accept, right? So we're going to have it where it's in Q1. We're going to make an epsilon move. If the top of the stack is Z0, right? If we have no more X's, then the top of the stack will be the start symbol, right? But in that case, it will be Q2, and it won't mutate the stack. Just keeps that as Z0. That 0 is looking a little too delta for me, or belta. It's looking a little sketchy. So I'm about to say belta. That's not really a letter. It's somewhere between a belch and delta. It's quite a transition of flatulence, okay? So anyways, so notice that this actually defines the transition function. For all others, they're going to be empty. So if you're wondering where all the other triples are, they're all empty. They're going to result in empty sets. So you might ask, Dan, is there a nice convenient way for me to describe this without having to do all of this triples business with the pairs and sets? Yes, of course there is. There's a generalized transition diagram, which now I'm going to show you how that works. So we can draw a generalized transition diagram So just if you're wondering what the transition table would look like, it's going to be so each one of these slots in your table would be a listing of these pairs. If it doesn't have any pairs, meaning that for any one of these, I didn't give you a non-empty set, they're all going to be empty. Is that clear? So I'm going to focus instead on the transition diagram. So this will help us understand how transitions work. So how is it going to work? We're going to have nodes or vertices that are the states of the PDA. We're going to have arrows just like we had before. But we're going to have them have a very specific form. So I'm going to start off with the one that points to the start state. Like with an epsilon NFA for the start state. Usually people put the word start above the arrow, but it's not necessary all the time. I generally do it just to make it a little clear that it's not anything else. And of course we have the doubly circled states are final. So they're final or accepting states. Now you'll notice really quickly that I didn't actually say anything about how a PDA accepts input. We just sort of just presume it at this stage. I'll get into more detail about this when we get there. But for our purposes, just imagine that when it finishes consuming the input, if it's in a final state, it's accepting. But I'll get into more detail about how that works here in a moment. And with the PDA, there's a lot of different ways we could talk about accepting and rejecting. I'll stick to one. At least for now. So we're going to have arcs, which are transitions of the PDA. So we're going to have directed edges. So I'm going to label them with a very specific form. each arc is labeled. It's going to have this particular form. It's going to be A. We're going to have X with a slash. And instead of this being A, let's make this alpha. So you might ask what A is. This is the input red. X is the old top of the stack. And alpha is the new top of the stack. So this is what you're replacing with. So just to be very clear, what I mean by this is that if you see something like this, delta PAX, it contains pair Q alpha. And this is where if you're going from state P to state Q. So one thing I need to be careful about, and I'll mention this as an aside, is that normally we're going to presume that the start symbol is already on the stack. If ever it's unclear to your reader, please specify what the start symbol is. For example, some people define PDAs where there is no start symbol. Instead, it always starts off with an empty stack. Some people define it like that. We won't here. So just always assume that Z0 is always the start symbol and it's going to be on the stack at the beginning. That's what we're going to presume. So let's now draw out what one of these transition diagrams would look like. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to come up with our generalized transition diagram. Now remember we had 3 states, right? We had 3 states. I'm losing my notes. That's how excited I am. So we had 3 states, right? We had Q0, Q1, and we had Q2. Q2 was a final state, so I'm going to double circle it. Q0 is the start state, so I'm going to indicate that quite clearly. And do you remember, just before I get too ahead of myself, I'm going to put in those epsilon moves. So remember, I can go from Q0 to Q1 on epsilon, so on an epsilon move, if the old top of the stack is Z0, and I replace it with itself, right? I could do that. Likewise, I could do something quite similar where I see the top of the stack is X, I replace it with X. And then also we had this one where after we made sure there's no more X's left, to get over to Q2 requires that Z0 is on the top of the stack, right? And we don't change it. So these are our transitions to get from Q0 to Q2. So notice that to get over to Q2, do you notice that I could actually just take epsilon moves to get over here without actually consuming anything? Do you notice that? So it's going to be really important when we think about this PDA that it has to consume the entire input. It has to gobble that sucker up. So we had some transitions that occur among Q0, Q1 that stay within their same state. Remember, we had it where we push the zeros, but every time I have a 0, I'm actually going to replace that top of the stack with an X. So the top of the stack becomes So it's the old top, new top. If I see a 0, if I see an X at the top of the stack, I replace that with 2 X's. So now X is the top of the stack. So in both cases, X becomes the top of the stack if I encounter a 0. Then I can move on over here. In either case, keep in mind, notice that this is not prohibitive of the idea that you can go over to here. Remember, you can just freely go here on an epsilon move. That's the non-deterministic nature of this machine. Does everybody understand that? So I can just, there's nothing stopping the machine from going into this state as one of the pairs. With the exception, as long as the top of the stack looks like has one of these two forms, meaning it's Z0 or X, which in either case it can happen, right? What matters here is that when it's done consuming all of the input, it's over here. That's the part that really matters. So when we're in Q1, what happens in Q1? Well, reads a 1, it does what?
It's poppin' time.
It pops, right? So on seeing an X, it pops. And here is our generalized transition diagram for our PDA P. So this PDA will recognize, so you can actually sit down and prove this, but what you can do is you can take a look at this and notice that it actually recognizes the language that we were desiring before, namely that 0 to the n, 1 to the n, such that n is greater or equal to 0. So it does indeed recognize this language. Pretty nice example, right? So are there any questions about our transition diagram at all? So I'm going to show you another example of designing a PDA before we get into kind of what our discussion about, because I remember I've been sort of alluding to how acceptance works with a PDA, because it can work in a couple different ways. I'll give you a bit of a heads up. I'm going to pick one of the two, but there's several other ways you can characterize in equivalent ways, so meaning that there exist PDAs that can be equivalently constructed that have this behavior. Ours is always going to, we're just going to be exploring something called acceptance by final state, which is something we're familiar with, but you can define other ways, as I'm going to talk about later. Namely, acceptance by empty stack. So that's actually one of the reasons why I've introduced the start symbol, is if you want to make the machine accept, you just have to have it so the stack becomes empty. So the stack becomes empty upon reading the input. You're good. You don't have to be in a final state in that case. You just cobble up the input. If the stack's empty, you're all good. So in that case, you can see that there gives also some flexibility, but it most certainly does not give you any more computational power by doing that. It's actually equivalent. There's another, for a PDA that accepts by a final state, there's always an equivalent one for these empty stack cases. So I thought it'd be a good idea we see another example. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. But we're going to do this one within the context of trying to come up with a generalized transition diagram. The real meat and potatoes is coming up. Namely, when we start talking about instantaneous descriptions. Because instantaneous descriptions, they are versatile in how they allow us to describe the computation of the machine, but also it adds a whole other layer to how you'd have to talk about acceptance too. So let's think about this. So let's talk about something else here. So previously we'd actually seen how to design a PDA, and this is a generalized transition diagram for a PDA that recognizes this language. I'm going to show you another example. Namely, we're going to examine the even length palindromes. So as you might recall, even length palindromes the language of these palindromatic strings, they are not regular. So most certainly you cannot come up with a DFA or even an epsilon NFA that recognizes or describes said languages. So recall this language is this one, where we're going to have W reverse such that W is some binary string. So we're going to talk about the binary, even like palindromes. So recall that this is just simply some binary string. This is the same binary string, but in reverse. Hence why we have our reversal notation here. So that's an example. If I have 0, 1, 1, 0, this is an even length palindrome, right? It's namely, this is W reverse. So what I'm going to do is I want to try to use some of the ideas we actually had from over here. So do you recall when we considered 0 to the n, 1 to the n, we pushed symbols to keep a count, of how many zeros we read, right? Well, we can try to take this idea, and instead of it being that we're counting them, let's try to use it to come up with a pattern. Almost like an obstacle course for the PDA to clear, but in reverse afterwards. Because there's a very nice property that stacks actually have, is if I give you so I want you to look carefully at how I stack these plates. So notice I have green, blue, I have this pinkish one, and I got this lighter pink one. This is more of like a light purple. So do you notice that if you read this, it's green, blue, we got this one here, and then we got the pink one, right? So notice that if I were to pop them as per,
It's poppin' time.
notice that if I pop them, I get that one, then this one, then the blue one, and then the green one. If you look at the order for which they're in, do you notice that the order in which I read them to you, and if I were to take up and examine them from this direction upward, do you notice that they're actually in reverse? We're going to try to take advantage of this property. So a stack actually has this nice property. So you can imagine almost like I'm this little guy here, little guy or gal. I go through an obstacle course. And as I go take the obstacle course this way, I would like to make sure that when I come back, I remember the order in which I took these obstacles to get back to the beginning. Imagine it's like a lap, but I want to remember where these obstacles are. So that's what the purpose of the stack is going to be. I'm going to try to take advantage of the fact that the reversal of the string comes out as the order in which I would pop these. It's just like I'm retracing my steps back to get back over to the beginning by remembering where these obstacles are. And what kind of symbols can I have? I can have zeros or ones, right? So I'm going to imagine every time I have one of these obstacles, you can imagine each one might be a 0 or a 1. So it might be an X or a Y respectively. So to get back, I got to make sure I see a Y and then an X to get back over here, right? Because that's what the obstacles were. But you notice when I go back, it's just like I'm going backwards through here. It's akin to the idea of pushing these symbols, then popping them. So let's think about how this would play out then. So we're going to come up with a PDA. I'm going to give you the description of the PDA, but I'm going to give the transition function in terms of the generalized transition diagram. So I'm going to think again of this like in phases like I did before, where I originally had this one where I was reading in the zeros. This one I'm pulling off whenever I count it as zeros, but with ones. And then if I get over here after I consume the entire input, symbol by symbol, I'm good, right? Anything else, it doesn't matter. So where our PDA, we're going to call it PPAL. I think that's a cute name. It's again going to have 3 phases. you're going to think of this as one phase to take my friend over to here. Then I'm going to have another phase that's going to get me from here back over here. And then I ultimately need to make sure I didn't hobble over one of these obstacles in the way that I wasn't supposed to, right? I need some way of checking that. And fortunately, if you think back to how our stack works, we have a very simple way of checking that, akin to that example over there, right? So we're going to have three states, Q0, Q1, and Q2. Our input symbols are 0 and 1, right? So the symbols that are used for our input strings. We're going to have X, Y, and Z0 as our tape alphabet, or tape symbols of delta. We're going to have Q0. We're going to have Z0 as a start symbol, of course. And our set of final states is just going to contain Q2. So with the following generalized transition diagram. So I'm going to draw it over here. So I'm hoping to give you an intuition about this based on this example over here. So think about it going through this obstacle course. I need to make sure when I come back, if I'm coming back this way, I don't forget about the order in which I came to them, but backwards. And fortunately, the stack will remember this information for us. So here we go. So I'm going to use this kind of as a template to help me get started here. So I'm going to have Q0, right? I'm going to have three states, Q0, Q1, and I'm going to have Q2. Q2 is the final state. We can have multiple final states, of course, but we don't need too many in this case. So again, I want to get over to Q2, right? But I need to make sure I consume the entire input. But suppose that I gave you an even length palindrome, but there's nothing saying that it can't just be the empty string, right? It's even length. 0 is even, right? So most certainly I need to make sure I account for this case. So the first thing I would do is I need to make sure I can make an epsilon move from Q0 to Q1 where I don't modify the stack at all. And also I need the same thing here to get from Q1 to Q2 if I have the empty string, right? So this will account and allow me to accept on the empty string, right? However, remember back to our idea here. We're going to have it where we're going to be pushing X's and Y's for zeros and ones respectively. So it might be the case that the top of the stack might actually have an X on it. In that case, we don't touch it, right? And also it may have a Y at the top of it, right? But if you're thinking back to our idea here about the obstacle course, think about it. Remember, think like we're dealing with a stack. So imagine we have 0, 1, 1, 0. So I have Z0 right here, right? We know that's there right at the beginning. If I get a 0, that's an X. I get a 1, that's a Y. 1, that's a Y. And then 0 is an X. So what conditions are required for me to get to Q2 upon reading the input? Well, think of it. Pushing is like I'm going through the obstacle course. Popping is like we're going back through the obstacle course, but in reverse. So you know you're not going to touch this. We've already accounted for how we get to the part where we're going to be going back through the obstacle course. We're going to hope or cross our fingers we're given an input string for which we're not skipping over anything that we shouldn't be doing in an obstacle course. We shouldn't be cheating, right? But fortunately for the form what we're going to have here, this will ensure that it won't be able to get over to Q2 without having to get rid of all those X's and Y's. That's the point. So in Q0, there's possibilities that can happen. The first thing is we might have the possibility where we're going to push an X, right? When we have Z0 on the top of the stack. So in that case, it's very similar to what we have up here, right? We're going to need another one for that case as well. Where if x is on the top of the stack, we push an x. Not too much different from there, but we also now have to account for the case when we have 1, right? But we also have another case. Notice that the stack may have it where there's an x on the top of the stack, but I have a 1 I'm consuming. So I might have to push a y on top of an x, and vice versa. So we're going to have a 1. Of course, we're going to have it where we z0. We get a y with z0. We have a 1, where we're going to have it where the y's at the top, and we'd push another y, right? However, we're going to have a couple more. Now, I'm running a little low on space here, so I'm going to try drawing them up here. So we're going to need when I read a 0, and there's a y present at the top, then I'm going to have to make sure I can push an x on top of the y, right? And if I have 1 and it's x on the top, I need to make sure I put a y on top of the x. So that's not too bad, right? Usually it's a good idea to stack these on top of each other. Just make it very easy to tell. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think I've accounted for all possibilities, right? Now, naturally, how should pop-in time happen? How should pop-in time happen then? If you think back to how this works. Well, what is a y? Y corresponds to what? So think of it like this. So y is a 1, x is a 0. So I want to make sure I can do pop-in time on all of these so I consume all of these stack symbols. So consuming is a kind of a weird phrase for me to use here. I mean pop all of them, right? What we're doing is...
It's poppin' time.
Yeah, we're doing pop-in time. So whenever I have a 0, I want to pop an x. When I get a 1, I want to... It better be that there's a y at the top of the stack, and I pop that. We do pop-in time.
Poppin' time.
Right? So it better be the case that if there's a 0 that I'm going to consume next, it better be that x is at the top of the stack. Otherwise, we're in trouble, right? It's going to kill that thread. Likewise with 1, if it better be that there's a y at the top of the stack. So just to walk us carefully through an example, like if I had 0, 1, 1, 0, this is actually what the stack would look like upon moving into Q1. So that's one possible way of executing this, right? Keep in mind, there's going to be many of these occurring non-deterministically, right? This is the one we would like to think is the thread that leads us to acceptance. So as I talked about previously, the concept of instantaneous descriptions will allow us to easily talk about this non-determinism. In a way, it's a little bit easier. But if you're familiar with an epsilon NFA, it's going to be very similar to this, except now we have the stack in play. So notice here that if I see a 0, which in this case, so if I read this, so imagine I read this. So what's going to happen is I start reading 0 and 1, right? So that's the first half, right? So 1, so let's actually look carefully at what we got going on here. Because is that really what the stack does in the terms of the accepting? No, right? What actually happens looks more like this. So that's one possible execution. As I said, instantaneous descriptions are going to allow us to talk a little bit more about this carefully. Because there is going to be one path of execution, one possible path that would push all of these onto the stack. Right? It's going to happen. That's one possibility based on the moves that we have over here. It's one possibility. However, you'll notice quite quickly that it won't have enough symbols to consume to get over to Q2 in that case. As I said, we'll talk more about this later. But here's the one that will actually get you to acceptance. So you read the first two symbols. You consume these first two. You get X and Y. You make the epsilon move over to Q1. Sorry, these are two very similar ones. They do the same pattern. So I go to Q1 over here. I see a 1. What I do?
It's poppin' time.
It consumes the 1, pop in the 0, pop in the y, sorry. Then it pops the 0 on the x, and we end up with consuming the entire string. We make the epsilon move over the Q2, and we accept. So you'll notice that there's a lot of possible passive execution that could happen with a PDA based on the stack and the state you're in. Akin to what we talked about with the epsilon NFA, except now we have a stack in play too. So those pairs, there's many possible ways this can get carried out. But yeah, so this is in fact a PDA that will recognize the even length palindromes over the binary alphabet. So are there any questions about that one? Any questions? Any questions? So I'm just going to grab another marker here. But yeah, notice that the whole trick here is that it actually isn't that you read the entire input to take one lap. It's actually you cut it in the middle. That's the trick. I was hoping that you'd catch on to this, is that the obstacle course actually goes through the first half, then wrapping it back around goes in backwards. But yeah, next we're going to be talking about instantaneous descriptions, which is easily going to be one of the more intricate aspects of this lecture. It's not, as a concept, it's not terribly scary. It's just there's a little bit of notation, and I know some people that's a little scary at first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep ppal here. I should have really drew this over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to redraw this, but I'm going to put it over here because we're going to put a diagram over here. So I'm just going to go like this. Like that. So let's get a transition diagram up. Do I want to do ppal or... Let's do a ppal. So we're going to have 3 states. We're just going to move this on over here. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna need to nudge. I think my start state needs to be judged. Yeah, just need to nudge it over a little bit more. My apologies. So down and to the right, down and to the right, down and to the right. Oops. It's going to be important that we have this transition diagram in front of us. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit of a difficulty for us to actually see how this plays out. Epsilon x, x, epsilon y, y. And then we have 0, x, and we pop. It's pop in time, right? On a Y, it's popping time. And then we have the 6 possible moves that can happen. Z0, X, Z0, 1, Z0, Y, Z0. We have 0, 0, 1, 1. We have the 4 possible other things that can happen. X, we push an X. We have a Y at the top of the stack. Then we have X, Y. If it's an X, then we have YX. And then we have Y, Y. Okay, there we go. There we go. We got it there. So what I'm going to do next is I want to talk about instantaneous description. So what we're going to do is I'm going to first do a doodle over here, and we're going to come back to this when we actually talk about it, because it's a little intricate of a diagram, and I don't want to mislead. So give me one moment to write it over here, and then we'll talk about instantaneous descriptions there, and we'll come back over here, and it'll make a lot more sense. So just give me a moment. I should put some music on. Let's put some music on. Let's find some random music here. That should be fun. Here. I know. We'll put something that... There we go. Just make sure I got that in the frame. Okay, good. Give me a little bit of a crunch. It's always fun when I do this because I always have to have a lot of different. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3, 4. 5, 6. This one. Then we have this. I need to bring this in just a little bit more. I call this song, although it's for Donkey Kong Country 3, it is definitely the song of trying to fit everything on the board. I feel like I'm going to do some stage performance here. Let's see. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to use a different color to help us get the moves. Let's see, one here, one there. Hey, now I gotta fill in the blanks. For those that are wondering, this will describe the execution process of a PDA. We're going to describe one for an input string there. So for example, this will be one path of execution. One possible part of the non-determinism here. So notice that this one's actually just us consuming a 0 each time. For that guy over there. So notice it'll just push X's. And you'll notice, I'll give you a little heads up. This will be where the right one that will get us down over here. Notice this one is the one that gets us to accepting. I'll give you a heads up that this is the one that'll, and keep in mind there could be several of these, but just one of them is necessary for acceptance. But at least by final state, that this will be the one where it reads the first half and then it pops the second half. So just take that as a note as we're going through this. One is when we have the 2 that we've consumed. So I'll give you a heads up. This is the one that's going to get us to accepting. But I'll get to the botched ones first. 1, 2, 3. Z0. Q1. Epsilon. X. X. Z0. But yeah, just give you a heads up when we get to it. It's going to be the number of moves as you go downwards. Number of transitions. I guess I could turn off the music now. Okay, there we go. Hopefully you enjoyed that little fun. Let's see. I'm just looking at where we're at here. But yeah, if you're wondering what this instantaneous description stuff is going to give us a mechanism for describing languages that the PDA decides or recognizes. Let's see here. Just looking at where we're at here. Don't need that. Okay. Let's get into this. I've been hyping up these instantaneous descriptions for a good while, so let me get into this now. So up to this point, we haven't really talked about how a PDA actually computes formally. So one mechanism for me to describe this to you is using something called an instantaneous description. So if you're wondering what that means, it just means, as it literally says, instantaneous description. It gives you a description of what the machine is doing at that time. So we really haven't defined how PDA processes the input. So in the past, when we defined computing for an automaton, we had this idea of an extended transition function. Now, we have a little bit more to talk about than just having us talk about the state now. We have the state. We also have what's going on at the top of the stack as well, right? But we also need this idea of consuming a symbol like a hungry, hungry hippo, where we do a lot of pushing and popping possibly onto the stack. We do plenty of...
It's poppin' time.
Exactly. So the mechanism for which we're going to use here to describe the changes of the state, the input, and the stack is using this concept here. So, oh no, my little friend. Little turtle friend, get up there. There we go. There we go. So we use, and I'm going to abbreviate instantaneous description or instantaneous descriptions as ID or IDs. We use instantaneous descriptions to describe how we go from one configuration, namely we're talking about the state and its contents of the stack, how we go from one configuration to another. An instantaneous description for pushdown automaton is a triple. Again, we're pulling up the three tuples here. It's going to have this form: Q, W, lowercase gamma, where Q is going to be a state. So Q is a state. W is going to be the input left to process. So remember, we consume the symbol or process the symbols, right? So this is what's going to be remaining before we're done computing. And lowercase gamma is going to be the stack's contents. So you're going to assume that we're going to read it left to right to mean top to bottom. So left to right means top to bottom. So we're going to describe the machine based on these triples. And each one of these will tell us one configuration the machine can be in. So now I need to describe to you what it means to consume a symbol. I've been talking about this as hungry, hungry hippos thing. Like, we need to actually have a formal notion for this. So let's talk about consuming a symbol. So suppose we have symbol A. And I must stress that this can be epsilon. To move from one instantaneous description to another, we're going to suppose we have our transition function, which says we're going to transition on state P on A, where we have X, and it contains as one of its pairs Q alpha. Then what this will look like then for any W, so any string over that alphabet or input symbols, then for anyone over this, and beta, which is going to be some string of stack symbols or stack alphabet, what it means is that I can write P A W. So A would be in front of the string that would be left after I consume A. Then I have X beta. So to describe a move, I use this tilted sideways T. And it goes from P to Q, because remember it says Q here. And it says it consumes A, and then it replaces the top of the stack with what? Alpha, right? The top of the stack was X before, now it's alpha. So what we just described here is what we call a move of the PDA. This is what we call a move of a PDA. So this is how we could describe going from one configuration to another configuration. Naturally, if you have several of these pairs in a set, that means there's going to be potentially several configurations the PDA will be simultaneously. So one note I also need to make, similar to some of the notation we've used in the past for derivations, for example, we might use this one for set one or more moves. Actually, we'll say 0 or more, because technically you can write it on itself. An instantaneous description can be the same for itself if it doesn't gobble anything, right? So we'll use this to mean 0 or more moves. Similar to our derivation process. So you might ask, okay, so how are you going to define this? Well, now I'm going to have to come up with an inductive definition for this. So I'm going to define what that means right now. But actually, before I do that, let's actually consider what an execution of a string would look like for a given PDA. I think that's a great idea. So rather than talking about this yet, we'll talk about this in a moment. Let's consider what happens with a given input string for a given PDA. What actually happens for what all of these possible configurations it can be based on moves. So let's consider PPAL here. Now, PPAL here, this PDA, it'll recognize all even length palindromic binary strings. So we came up with this over here. It has 3 states. And the whole idea here is that we try to push, an accepting string would push W, and then it will pop W in reverse based on the properties of a stack. So that's the goal here for acceptance. Now, of course, if it's welcome to stay in Q0 and consume more symbols and push more symbols, right? It can do that. That is possible based on the non-deterministic nature of a PDA. But most certainly, that won't lead, in our case, to an accepting state. And it won't, and the most important part of this is how we guarded off Q2, right? Notice that Q2 requires that the stack is presently just has a start symbol on it, but it has to consume the entire string to get over there, right? In the case it accepts. So this is allowing us to guard this off. If we were consuming them all over here, then what happens is you would end up with a whole bunch of stuff on your stack, right? We're going to see that in a moment. That means they'll still have to get popped, but we have no more symbols to consume. So there's almost like a weighing process with this PDA for how we get an accept on a palindromic string, namely an even length one. So I'm going to lay out what these triples would look like, where each one of these could be a move that takes you from one configuration to another. So I've labeled them based on the number of moves that occur. So these are all the possible configurations based on a number of moves. Namely, this is the starting configuration if your input string is... So suppose I give you the string with 4 zeros. So it's 4 zeros. This is indeed an even length palindrome, right? You would agree that the first 2 zeros are the same order as if the reversal of them for the last 2, right? So this is indeed an even length palindrome. So I want you to look carefully at how this plays out. So you'll notice that there's many ways that the PDA can proceed based on what we have over there. So look at Q0. So just to reemphasize the main point here, there is a path of execution for the PDA, namely a sequence of configurations described by instantaneous descriptions that take me from the starting configuration, namely, notice that this is the string W, this is the start symbol, that's what presently is on the stack, right? And it starts in Q0, right? There is some path of execution described by what we had over there, by moves, using instantaneous descriptions, these IDs. Do you see it? Now, you can see right down here, if you follow the arrows to the right spot, you'll see it. And it'll match the intuition you're expecting. So notice it's right down here. We want it to be where it consumes the entire string, and it's in Q2. That's all we really care about, right? It's in a final state. Well, let's see how we can get there. Well, we already know you have to consume the first half before you start popping, right? That's the intuition behind that PDA over there. So you'll notice that if we follow this way, right? We go da-da-da-da-do. We consume the first 2 zeros. And then we want to pop the X's that are presently on the stack with the 2 zeros by consuming them. So we transition over to Q1 on the epsilon move over there. Then we pop. It's popping time by consuming a 0. Then we consume another 0 to pop off the last X. And that brings us down over here. So this, for example, is a sequence of configurations, a sequence of moves of the PDA, namely described by their IDs. So the configurations are the IDs, just to be very clear. The moves are how we go from one to the other. And notice that it's actually a sequence of instantaneous descriptions that tell me what's happening with the machine at each stage. Is that clear, everyone? So, for example, you know how I talked about how it is possible with this PDA to stay in Q0, gobble up all of the input, and then try to get over to Q2, but you can't because you have a whole bunch of stuff on your stack. You don't have Z0 on the stack. It's actually this scenario right here. So notice it consumes 0, pushes on the stack, right? Pushes an X on the stack. Consumes, push, consume, push. No more, but it has 4 X's. But notice it cannot, it can freely move over to Q1 based on the way we have this set up, but it cannot go to Q2, right? It can't go to Q2. Why? Because the top of the stack isn't Z0, right? It's X. So that's just how we're gating off Q2. So please note, this is just like what we talked about with non-determinism in the past. You can imagine these as threads that we're generating based on the possible moves that can occur. Remember, it's a set of pairs. So each set of pairs dictates a new possible path of execution. So non-deterministically, you can imagine it like it going along the red pathway, or you can imagine it like it's exhausting all of these. And then it happens to get to this one. So what does it mean to reject then? Is there any ideas of what rejecting the string would look like then? Well, think of it. It's like a path. One of these paths can never lead to a configuration for which it accepts, right? Where it consumes the input and it's in a final state, right? So it means that all of them have to be enumerated. Notice there's an asymmetry here. That's typical in non-determinism. So now let's talk about how we can describe a sequence of moves using our notation over here. Actually, let me keep this over here. Actually, no, let's head over here. I'm going to define it, and then I'll do an example showing you how I get one of these over here using this notation. It's very helpful when you're talking about formally how the PDA gets processed for a given input string. So I'm going to get rid of this too, because we got the idea about how this works. I need to define for you how that notation works. Because it's important, because otherwise we are going to have a hard time saying what it means to accept. So we're going to define that notation I described for 0 or more moves inductively. So we're going to define a move of 0 or more moves inductively as follows. So the basis for this definition, so naturally when I describe it inductively, you know right away that if you wanted to prove something about your PDA using this concept of instantaneous description, you know right away this is going to be your best friend, right? It's described inductively. So, namely, if I give you an ID I, of course, it represents 0 or more moves. So it means that indeed it's indeed I still. It can be. And this is true for every I instantaneous description I. So this is committing 0 moves, right? So this is 0 moves. So you can stay in your own configuration as described as an instantaneous description. So to go from an ID I to an ID j via some number of moves, it means that this can happen if there exists some ID, some instantaneous description k, so that you can move from I to k, and k through 0 or more moves gets you over to j. Now, you might say, Dan, that's not really satisfactory. Now you just kind of told me, yeah, it's just kind of like you can make one move over to k, and then you can take 0 or more moves from k to j. Well, let me describe it now a little bit more carefully. So more carefully, I moves from I to j. That's often how you might say this. It moves from I to j if there is a sequence. If there is a sequence I1, I2, all the way up to IN, so that I is equal to I1 and IN is equal to j, and for each I is equal to 1, 2, all the way up to n minus 1, it has to be that I can move from instantaneous description II, Captain.
It's poppin' time.
I can go from II to II plus 1. So I want to do an example with you, just showing you how you can use this notation. So let me get to, let's consider another example. I'm going to use PPAL. So if you need to look at PPAL again, I recommend taking a look at it on your notes. So suppose that the input string is 1001. Then the initial configuration PPAL would be is in Q0. It has 1001 0, right? This is the initial configuration. This is the initial ID. Right? This is the input. I haven't consumed anything yet. This is what the stack looks like. That starts in Q0. Now, of course, I can make a move by gobbling up 1 and then pushing a Y, right? In Q0. So I can go, I gobble up the 1, yummy, yummy stuff. I get a Y pushed onto the stack, right? I can, of course, continue this process. I can do another move. Let's gobble up a 0. So we gobble up this symbol. Because remember, you have to read it left to right. Then you get an X on the top of the stack because it was a 0 this time. Is nummy stuff. Nummy num. Now, after that, I could, for example, just freely move over to Q1 on the epsilon move. Because remember, X is the top of the stack, so I can freely move to Q1. Then I'm going to now consume the 0. Consuming the 0 is the same as, to do that means I'm going to pop off an X, right? That's a valid move. Hence, there is going to exist an instantaneous description that describes such a move. Okay? Q1, 1. Now I'm going to pop
It's poppin' time.
on X. And then lastly, we're not quite done yet, but I'm going to consume, we're going to consume the 1. We're going to pop
It's poppin' time.
Y. And then lastly, we're just going to move on over to Q2. So based on this information, did we accept, or is this PDA going to accept the string? So notice that this is just one of the pathways over there, but keep in mind that's for a different input string. If you were to give me W, like this, it would have its own version of what we have over there. And this time it will. You'll know right away because you'll notice this is an even length palindrome, right? That's how we designed the PDA. So naturally it gets over to Q2. So this is actually a description of one of those pathways, except when W is equal to 1001 as opposed to 000. 0. I mean 4 zeros, yeah. So keep in mind, this is just describing one path of execution. You could do the same thing with what we had over there, except you would consider that particular W. Is that clear, everybody? So another way I could describe this whole process to you is should remind you, I could say, or more briefly, we can say this: Q0, 1, 0, 0, 1, Z0, and then I could use my turn side here, my symbol here. I'm pretty sure it's called a turn side. I'm pretty sure turn side star. Now I want to double check this. Somebody can look into this and look up the symbol turn side. It probably is this one here, except without the star. It's a symbol in logic. But yeah, I'm going to use this notation here. I can actually describe all of this sequence based on this definition, right? So I knew it. See? Yeah, so I'm just using the turn side notation here. See, I know my stuff. I don't make up everything I say here. That's a joke, of course. But yeah, so this is just an example of me using this notation. So this notation is for me to describe all the moves. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's turnstile. Yeah. So, anyways, you might ask, Dan, how can this notation be useful for describing the processing of a string with a PDA? Well, I want us to revisit PPAL, and now I want to show you how I can know what a string that gets accepted by this PDA looks like using this notation for moving from one ID to another. So let's look at this now. So now I want to show you how this notation is rather versatile. This is something that you might do in a proof, for example. Notice with PPAL, and I'm talking about like the PDA PPAL. Don't read that quite literally, okay? So PPAL, if we are given a string of the form WW reverse, well, what happens? It's going to push, well, as we said, it pushes a whole bunch of X's first, and Y's, of course, corresponding to W. Pushes X's and Y's corresponding to W. And we'll call that Y, just like lowercase y. We can see that, WW reverse gets accepted by PPAL. And here, I'll show you how this notation is rather helpful for us to describe this process. So check this out. So imagine the input is WW reverse, Z0. Well, as we just said, through 0 or more moves, it will get me from Q0 to this instantaneous description, which is going to be W reverse, so it's going to consume W. But what is that? That's Y reverse. Because remember, the stack will put them up. Remember the whole thing with the stack is that it's going to put them like this, right? But what does it do? It reverses it. So when it pops, doing its pop-in time, it's going to get them all in reverse, right? So this is what the stack will look like after I push all of those X's and Y's for W, right? Then it transitions on one move over to Q1, right? It's not in Q0 anymore. Then I have WR, then I have YR, or Y reverse Z0. Then after this, because there's always going to be a matching Y for a 1 and an X for a 0, it will be the case that for this string, or any string of this form, that after 0 or more moves, it'll be Q1, then it will consume W reverse, and it will pop Y reverse. And you end up with that. And then lastly, on a single move, you go from Q1 to Q2, where you have nothing else to read, right? The whole string has been read. But we're in Q2. So notice that this describes what I had in red over there for one example. This is actually a general way of writing the same thing that I kind of visualized over there in red. Isn't that neat? So this is a way I could describe what's happening with the machine for one possible path of execution. And remember, the execution itself, just because, remember, it's non-deterministic, it'll take the form of what? A tree-like form, right? So one possible pathway, as long as it consumes the entire string, gets me to the final state. That's the ID for such a situation. Now that we have the instantaneous descriptions, now I can describe to you what the language of a PDA is. And it depends on how we accept in a PDA. So we're going to consider acceptance by final state. I must stress that there exists other ways you can make a PDA accept, such as acceptance via empty stack. We won't consider that here, but if you understand the main idea here, it's fairly easy to see how you could translate definitions we're talking about here into that context. So we're going to be considering our conventional notion of acceptance. So I'm going to use consider twice. This is such a ooh for me to do. It's because I skipped a whole bunch of fun things in our notes that have all sorts of details in them. So consider any PDA P, so any pushdown automaton P, the language accepted by P, P sigma gamma delta Q0 Z0 F by final state I'll give it a name, denoted L of P, is the following. So L of P, the language of PDA P, is as follows. So it's any string W such that if you start from the initial configuration described by this ID, this one, after 0 or more moves, you can get to this ID, QF epsilon alpha, where QF is, of course, among the final states, and alpha is any stack string. So what you might be asking is what else has to be the case? Remember, like we've reiterated a few times, It has to consume the input and has to be in a final state. And that's what you characterize as the language of a PDA P when it accepts via final state. So just to emphasize the rules here for acceptance and rejection based on what we've discussed here. So let's summarize this. So P accepts if all of W is consumed and P's current state is a final state. Now, otherwise, P rejects W. And that should be unsurprising to you, is that there has to be the case that one of the states that the PDA is in has to have it where it's described in this fashion for its instantaneous description. So it's in a final state, it's consumed the input, and we don't really care what's going on with the stack. Okay? So if there exists a way to go from the initial ID to any ID that looks like this, it accepts. If it fails to do this, then it rejects. So again, note the asymmetry here. So I was thinking, so are there any questions about what the language of a PDA is? So notice it's carefully described through instantaneous descriptions. So as long as there exists one path of execution that gets me to that final state where it consumed the entire input, i.e. it reads the input in its entirety, then it accepts. Otherwise, it has to be that there is no way to get to an ID that looks like this. Which means that if it is the case, it's going to look something much more like this, where there's going to be some pathway. You have to consider all these pathways, possibly. Is that clear? So there is an asymmetry here. So as long as there exists one like this, it accepts. It rejects if there is none. That's the fun thing about non-determinism, is that it's in all of these configurations at the exact same time. That's one way you can interpret it, or like I said, it has a matter of clairvoyance. It's able to know, it knows which path is the red one over there. So I thought for one last thing we can do here today, is I thought it would be a good idea we design a PDA. We already looked at a couple, but I want to show you how you could take a PDA, say design a couple, and I'll show you how you can bring them together based on the versatility of their design to come up with one for a better, like a much more versatile language. And I think that'll be an excellent place for us to stop. So now we actually understand how a PDA works. So we talked about how it processes. We've talked about how it accepts, how it rejects. We've seen some examples. I think it'd be a good idea I show you one last example, now that we have a flavor for what it means to accept or reject. And I'm going to show you this explicitly because it's actually a nice thing, because it's something we've actually seen previously when we were exploring epsilon NFAs, is that we can use a similar kind of design pattern to help us. I don't want to say design pattern in a more exact way. I just mean it more as a matter of phrase to come up with new automata that can recognize more languages. So we're going to come up with a few new PDAs for us. And I think that's an excellent place for us to stop for today. Is it that we see one more example. And I wanted to show you this one specifically because I actually talked about this one last time. And I talked about it when we were talking about grammars. Namely, we talked about this issue of ambiguity. Actually, let me get the chat open. For some reason, I didn't have the chat open. My apologies. I was just chatting with you, and I'm like, look. So, anyways, I thought it would be a good idea I show you this next example because we actually talked about this specific one when we were talking about inherently ambiguous grammars. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to convince you of one thing I'll talk about actually probably next time we talk about PDAs and context-free grammars. Sorry, I'm getting really excited here.
It's poppin' time.
Sorry, that button's a lot of fun. So anyways, what we're going to do is we're going to be considering the following language. So we're going to consider this idea of using simpler PDAs to design more complicated ones. That's going to be the main thing we'll talk about here. Just going to switch markers again. The language we're going to be interested in is this one. So I'm just going to write this up here and then we'll get started here. Consider the language L, which is going to be of the following form: A to the I, B to the J, C to the K. Such that I, J, and K are all at least 0. And it has to be that I is equal to J or I is equal to K. Previously, we had actually talked about this. This is an inherently ambiguous grammar, inherently ambiguous language, meaning that this does not have a way that you could come up with a parse tree, like that's just only one possible derivation for some string like this. Like there's always going to be two possible parse trees or more for any one string. Sorry, there was always going to, sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. There's always going to exist a string for this language for which there exist two or more parse trees. No matter how slash and dash the context-free grammar. That's where this came up. I told you that there is, like, these always exist. So you can't just simply test if a grammar is ambiguous or not. As if, like, you could just avoid them. Like, they're always going to exist. It's even worse because you can't just give me a context-free grammar, an arbitrary one, and test if it is ambiguous or not. Such a test doesn't actually exist. There is no algorithm that can do this. It's what us in the theory space would call, it's undecidable. It's undecidable. There does not exist an algorithm for which it can tell you if it's ambiguous or not. And like I said, some of them there is no way you can make a grammar for this that isn't ambiguous. So I'm not talking about grammars here today, but I thought I would remind you where I got this from. But I want to show you how you can come up with a PDA for this sucker. So let's talk about that. So I thought I would show you another example of designing a pushdown automaton using a following technique. I would like to come up with one using simpler PDAs and then assembling them accordingly. Now, I want to consider this language. This is a rather interesting language. It's going to consist of strings of this form. It's going to have A to the I, B to the J, C to the K, where all of these I, J's, and K's are at least 0, but it has to be that either, at least one of the following have to be true. It has to be that I is equal to J or I is equal to K. So notice that it has to have equal numbers of A's and B's, or it has to have equal numbers of A's and C's. It can have at least one of those two in play. So what I was going to suggest to us, if you look at this and say, okay, well, it has this property and it is this or this. One natural thing to try is design a PDA such that this is true, and try to design a PDA where this is true, and then try to connect them or stitch them together so that you can go to one or the other. As long as we have some sequence of IDs or moves corresponding to those IDs that gets me to accepting via final state, we're okay. So I thought we would start off with considering a simpler PDA. So let's consider L1, which is just going to be the same thing we have up here. A to the I, B to the J, C to the K, such that I, J, and K are at least 0. And it has to be that I is equal to J in this case. So notice that by considering a simpler one, it makes it a little easier for us to play around with, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about this a little bit more carefully. Now I'm just going to have it where I'm going to make the input symbols the same as the stack symbols, just because it's a little easier to play around with if you think about it like that. So here we go. Let's look at what this means. If I is equal to J, that means that there's equal numbers of A's and B's for any one string in this language, and we don't care how many C's there are, right? This should remind you of one of our previous examples. So let's do something just like that. So we're going to design a PDA. We'll call it P1. Now that you know, we're going to be counting A's and B's, right? But we want to have an equal number of A's and B's, right? So that means that I'm going to be pushing symbols for A's, and I want to pop them for the B's, and I don't care about what C's going on with C. But we have to still consume those, right? So we're going to have Q's. I'll call this one Q1. I'm going to deliberately give them different names because I'm going to be assembling these. But it doesn't really matter. They're just names, right? So I'm going to have 3 phases just like we had in our previous example. I'm going to have epsilon, Z0, Z0, right? We want to make sure we could still get over here. But it may be the case that we're going to have it where we're going to push a bunch of A's onto the stack for each A, and then we're going to pop the A's on B's. So if we see an A, we're going to push an A onto the stack. If we see an A, of course, if A is on the top of the stack, if A is on the top of the stack, I want to push another A. However, if I get a B, what do I have to do?
It's poppin' time.
I have to pop the A's, right? So A will be on the top of the stack in this case, and I would pop it. And then lastly, I want to be able to get back over here now that the stack has been cleared out. So the stack's been cleared out. But I need to consume those C's. And they can be any number of C's. They could be 0 or more. So I'm just going to have a C here. I'm not going to do anything with the stack. I'm just going to leave it as is. I'm just going to gobble up the C's as they appear. And then I'll be still in Q3 anyways. So I'm going to call this one PDA P1. It's not terribly hard from what we've seen in the past to see that this is in fact going to indeed recognize this language via final state. And now let's consider another PDA for that one over there. So this is the case. So the first one is in the case when we have I is equal to J, right? The second case is when we have I is equal to K, right? So we're going to consider L2, which is going to be the same A to the I, B to the J, C to the K, such that I, J, and K are at least 0. And it has to be that I is equal to K in this case, right? So let's do something very similar, but it's going to be we have to be a bit careful now, because let's see what this means. So now this is saying that there's equal numbers of A's and C's, but we can have as many B's as we want. It can be 0 or more, right? So here's what I have in my head, because now we don't have this property where we can just stick around over here and just keep gobbling up C's, right? We have to make sure that there's an equal number of C's than there are to A's, right? So we're going to have to designate a state for doing this, because B's, there could be any number of B's, right? So I want to make sure I've accounted for that. So we're going to have 4 states this time. That's at least a pretty good idea. We're going to start off at Q4. I'm going to give it name Q4. So my whole point at the end of this is I'm going to try to combine these. Q4, Q5, Q6, and Q7 is going to be the final state. So, naturally, I'm just going to make sure there's some pathway to get over to that final state. But remember, it may be the case that there's some A's still on the stack, right? So the purpose of this one's for pushing A's. This one's for reading the B's. This is for popping on C. So that means we're going to gate off. We want to make sure we gate off Q7 from Q6, ensuring that we definitely have gotten rid of all of those A's that we're going to push on for corresponding C's that we're going to try to match up. So we're going to do the same thing we did over here. We're going to push some A's. A, Z0, A, Z0. And on A, with A's on the top of the stack, we're going to push another A. Here, if we see a B, we want to gobble up the B. It doesn't matter if it's Z0 on the top of the stack, we don't touch it. If it's A on the top of the stack, we don't touch it, right? We just want to make sure we can gobble up all those B's. We're very hungry like that. However, we have Q6. This is where we're going to need to do. So we're going to pop off wherever we see a C. We're going to pop an A off the top of the stack. So whenever there's a C, we're going to consume the C and we're going to pop an A. And by gating it off like this, we've ensured that the stack has to be where it just has the start symbol on it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have equal numbers of A's and C's, right? So, we're going to call this one PDA P2. So, one thing you should look at very carefully here is that L1 and L2, if you take the union of these two languages, you get this one. You get language L. So notice, interestingly, L is equal to L1 union L2. So take P1 and P2 together. Make a new start state. So this is something that you might have seen when we were exploring epsilon NFAs. We can do something very much like this here. So make a new start state, Q0, and introduce epsilon moves to the old start states. So what I'm saying is we're going to do the following. Check this out. These aren't going to be start states anymore. They're not start states anymore. Now check this out. So now we're going to come up with a PDA for language L. So So here's Q0. Now this is the new start state. Gonna make it allow it to have a move on epsilon, where it can freely move to Q1 or Q4. So it can do it at the same time, right? If you want to think about it like that. So notice that because it's an epsilon move, it can take on the pair associated with these that take them associated to each one of these pathways of sorts. So it might accept here, it might accept there, or it might accept both. The point is that I've allowed it now to have an option to take this one or this one because this language has this or quantifier right here. Sorry, it has this or over here, right? So remember it says this or that. So this one represents the first one, this represents the second one. As long as at least one of those two is satisfied, we're okay, right? So I've introduced epsilon moves, and now this is a PDA for L. Pretty nifty, right? So, any questions about that? So now this is a much, so you notice that the way I went about this is I came up with a simpler design based on how this language is defined. So notice there's an or here, so I took advantage of that fact. If it was an and, I might chain them like this, like one after the other, like this. Like if it has to be this, and it depends on this, what the definition is, right? If it's and, I might not necessarily get chained like this, then this, then this. It depends on what the form looks like. Right? The point I'm getting at is that it could be that like one comes after the other. Like if there was a star, you might use something similar to kind of like the star construction we had when we were talking about Thompson's construction. You might do something kind of like that, just like if you're doing concatenation. This is not very surprising that I would do something like this because we've seen something like this before, right? When we were exploring epsilon NFAs. The point I'm getting at is it always depends on the language of this thing. We took advantage of the fact there's an or right here. So we used it to come up with simpler designs, then we just brought them together using a technique that we've seen with epsilon NFAs. So you might ask, Dan, why should we care about PDAs? Well, the first thing it should stick out to you as a sore thumb is I've used this to just actually describe context-free languages. Did you notice that all the examples we've seen here are context-free languages? That's not a coincidence. So one thing that we will be seeing in the future, that I would like to explore in the future with you guys, is that actually that PDAs and context-free grammars, they describe the same languages. So you could go between these two, and by definition, that means that because any context-free language has a context-free grammar that describes it, that you can also equivalently define the context-free languages on PDA. So meaning the existence of a PDA that describes that language. So this is actually another equivalency that exists. So in the future, we'll explore this in the future. So are there any questions? I thought I would show you some examples, see how these things work. I like showing this and going into a lot of detail about it because I find that a lot of the formalisms tend to bog down a lot of the discussion, so I try to keep it very simple. Then we work to the more formal stuff. But yeah, no. Hopefully you guys had a good time.
It's poppin' time.
Yeah, it's poppin' time. So I'm thinking this is a great place for us to stop for today. Remember that if you want access to the notes, including the examples we've seen here today and some of the details I omitted, just because we don't need to go into all those nitty-gritty details here, is you want access to the notes, check out patreon.com/pagewizard. You can just go to pagewizardgames.com and you'll find all of the links that you might need to find to get over to here, okay? Also, please tell your friends to come join the fun. I'll be back with more exciting computer science lectures where we get to explore more theory of computation, but we're also going to be exploring some more topics, especially as we approach spring and summer. So
Get poppin'.
yeah, get poppin'. We're gonna go poppin'.
It's poppin' time.
Does-
It's poppin' time. It's poppin' time.
It's a poppin'. But yeah, so I'll say thank you so much, everybody. Hopefully you enjoyed the lecture today. I know I usually have fun with this one. And if you're curious more about this topic, let me know in the comments. I do appreciate the feedback on these things. It's part of how I refine my craft.
It was a poppin' good time.
It was okay. That's excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. I always have a good time with this. So I'll say thank you so much, everybody, and have yourself a beautiful day. I'll see you later.